The Brooklyn Vegan Show is a podcast about music brought to you by the music blog and online record store Brooklyn Vegan. Make sure to subscribe to hear all of our upcoming episodes featuring interviews with musicians and more, and find us 24/7 at brooklynvegan.com, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hey, welcome to the new episode of the Brooklyn Vegan Show. I'm BV editor Andrew Sacker, and today's episode is an interview with the musician who's been shaping punk and hardcore for over 30 years, Dan Yemin. Dan has not one but two new albums out this year, the first Paint It Black album in 10 years, Famine, out on Revelation Records, and the second album by his newer band Open City, Hands in the Honey Jar, out on Get Better Records. If you're not familiar, Open City has both Dan and Andy from Paint It Black, as well as Rachel Rubino on vocals. Rachel sang for Bridge and Tunnel and actually recently filled in as the guest lead vocalist at the On the Might of Prince's reunion shows. And their drummer is Chris Wilson of Ted Leo and the Pharmacist and Titus Andronicus. Both records are really good, and despite having two of the same people and pretty similar album artwork as we discussed in the episode, they're really cut from different cloths. I mean, the Paint It Black record, their first in 10 years, still sounds just as urgent as what they were doing in the early days. And the Open City record, where Dan plays guitar and Rachel sings, is a little more of a post-hardcore mentality, a little, still sticking to those classic hardcore influences, but, letting things go in some different directions. They're both really, really cool records, and I highly recommend listening to them both if you haven't heard them. Dan and I talk about both of those records on this episode, and we also talk about things like longevity in punk and hardcore and the importance of bridging the generation gaps in punk and hardcore. We look at some of Dan's history, the early days of Lifetime, everything from, some of the eye-opening influences for them early on, up through Kid Dynamite and Paint It Black's early days. And Dan also talks about continuing to write political music, protest music, despite how hopeless it can sometimes feel. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. I had a really good time talking to Dan, and I hope you enjoy it. But before we get to our episode, I just want to let you know that listeners of this podcast can get 30% off your first year's membership at DistroKid. DistroKid is a service for musicians that allows you to easily upload your music to all major streaming platforms, including Spotify, Apple Music, and more. It allows you to do automatic revenue splits so collaborators and co-writers can get paid too. It provides you with an artist page that links to your music on all streaming services and allows you to add lyrics, credits, liner notes, and more. You can get 30% off your first year's membership by signing up at distrokid.com/VIP/BrooklynVegan. We've also included the link in the description of this episode, and you can click directly from there. And now, here's my chat with Dan Yemin. Hey Dan, what's up? Welcome to the Brooklyn Vegan Show.
Not much. Thanks for taking the time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, so I think it's safe to say that for the past decade or so, you hadn't released music as quickly or as often as you used to. But this year, You've got two full-length albums out in close succession. What sparked all this recent creativity?
I think we've been working on this stuff for a while, and it just kind of all started to bear fruit within the last couple of years. I think obviously people are I'm sure tired of hearing about the pandemic, but that really slowed a lot of things down in terms of getting records done. So the Paint It Black record and the Open City record have been, in one way or another, like in process since like 2018 or even before.
So Paint It Black's been making music for over 20 years. You've been making music for over 30 years. And something that really strikes me about the new Paint It Black record is that, like hardcore is a genre that kind of tends to favor youth. And this just sounds like a great hardcore record. Like, all caveats aside. Yeah, no problem. I mean, it's just, straight up awesome hardcore record. Who are some bands you look to when it comes to like longevity in punk, or in general, what would you say are some things that factor into keeping the inspiration going after 3 decades?
Who do I look to? I think it's a complicated answer. But I look to peers, but also to young people. Like I look to what's going on with the kids that are making music and like pushing this musical form or art form or whatever forward and helping it evolve, like and are like kind of just all in hustling to make things happen and to make interesting music and to bare their souls for people. And I look at like all the like DIY kids and adults that are like making stuff happen in in our town and in their hometowns, like just not waiting for other people to make things happen for them, but just making them happen. Like that's a constant source of inspiration. Even more so as I get older and have like less time and less energy and less, just like watching what the kids are doing with punk and hardcore, with like underground music and in general, and also outside of music, like visual art and other things. Like I've always been really inspired by like artist collectives, like especially in Philly and in Providence, Rhode Island. Um, and because I think if anything, like the fine arts like gallery scene and museum scene is so much harder to break into than music. And like I've watched kids in Philly, and well, they're not kids anymore, but I watch people in Philly and Providence, especially like, and in New York too, just like make their own world for galleries and museums and art spaces and studio spaces, and that's like pretty amazing. In terms of peers, I my friend Brian Stern, he is older and never stops. He's played in like Dead and Gone and Look Back and Laugh and Punch and Needles, and he's never stopped. He's like our age and he's never stopped being in bands and putting out records. I think he's in like he came when we were recording and did some vocals on this record, and he's like I think in 3 bands right now that are putting out like playing shows and putting out records, and that's like phenomenal. Like by all accounts, people our age should be playing like chill indie rock and like mature college radio music, and that's cool. Like I listen to that stuff and I respect it, but it's not where my energy is. And so, are like another great inspiration is Jay Robbins from Jawbox, Burning Airlines. Um, he's always making new music with bands by himself. He has a recording studio. He's an amazing producer. We've done records with him, but I still go see him play live and I keep track of what he's releasing. He just released something this week. My other band, Bitter Branches, just recorded an album with him last month. Um, and I look at him and he's just like tireless. He's always making music and writing words and helping other people realize their vision of making music. And I hope that answers your question. I can go way off track. Like,
No, I
but
think off track is the best thing to go. I'm a fan of that. And yeah, I mean, it definitely does answer it. And does your perspective on like, I guess longevity and stuff kind of change over the years? Because I know, like, especially in punk, it's such a thing to be like, oh, I only like their first record. It's like such like you're brought up being like you're supposed to think this band gets bad. And I
right,
feel with me like I now will look at someone like Jay Robbins and be like, oh, it's so impressive what he's doing now, and my perspective like
yeah,
changes, and I don't have that like angry teenage like, oh, I only like the first two Jawbox records. You know what I mean?
totally. Actually, I don't like the first Jawbox record.
Yeah,
the
fair enough.
the the second one I listen to like probably once a month, but also the later stuff. I listen to all his bands. Um, but the key is to make music that is like evolving, but still has that like foundation of what made it exciting in the first place. Like it's cool to only like a band's first record, but I would say like if you say you only like our first record, you're probably a poser. Like you're not paying attention, or you just have bad taste. Uh, which is cool. Matters of taste can't actually be like disputed, and I'm kind of being hyperbolic, but also like also don't be a poser.
No, yeah, I mean for sure. I feel like anybody who's actually followed Paint It Black, like the progression, the evolution is like obvious, and like it's interesting because I feel like in most other, like, I don't want to say profession because I don't want to like call music necessarily a profession, but like in most other sort of life paths, it's almost like people are like, yeah, with more experience, you'll get better at what you do. And in
Yeah,
music, there's like this feeling of the opposite, like it's like, wait, they can like play way better now. Why do you think they are worse?
yeah, and I appreciate both ends of that spectrum, and really everything in between. Like I love the raw, like the thing that I think is still most compelling about hardcore punk is that it's like amateur,
Hmm.
and I really actually like. I think we play well, and we're good musicians, and we work hard and we practice. But like the professional level players, I find kind of tedious. Like um, and I think like whatever, there's space here for everybody. Like if you're like a virtuoso guitar player or drummer or whatever, that's awesome. But it's equally thrilling and interesting to see what people that are just like taught themselves to play last year are able to do. Because like energy and guts um, compensate for lack of experience, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, I forget who said this, but it's like I had read this somewhere recently. It's almost like when you do lack that traditional skill and training, that's often when like the most emotion can come out. Like I think that's what people have liked about punk and hardcore and related styles for so long is like if you're not really a good singer, you're like, well, I can't like hit a million notes, so I just have to put like my blood, sweat, and tears into this. And I think that's why we get like such emotional vocalists in like hardcore and punk and post
Yeah,
hardcore.
and like you know, Fugazi wasn't the best band ever because they were musical virtuosos. They're the best band ever because they practiced like 5 hours a day. They just like lived their band like for real. Not like lived their band like, oh, we have a meeting with our manager at 4 o'clock and then we're gonna begin the writing and recording and touring cycle again. They just lived their band. They like it was an embodiment of their beliefs and their politics and their feelings, and they just like practiced every day, all day.
Yeah. I mean, they're like a machine.
Yeah,
Well, to go back to what you were saying about, being inspired by younger bands, I mean, I feel like between Painted Black, Open City, and Lifetime, you've played shows in recent memory with like a lot of these kind of up and coming bands like Soul Glow, Gouge Away, Fiddlehead, Anxious, Truth Cult, the list goes on. I think it's a
yeah,
really interesting thing, this sort of generation gap bridging, because it's like, like I feel like if like Anxious opening for Lifetime, that's like when Painted Black would have started if you would have opened for like Minor Threat or something, like which at the time was like just completely unheard of because all those bands were
right.
gone. But also like I do feel like there's this new thing happening where there's this generation gap bridging that used to not really exist. I'm curious like your perspective on that and why you think that's either important or
I think it's essential. I mean, do you want to see like a 5 band bill of bands where everybody's in their 40s? I mean, maybe they're all awesome, but like, I don't know. I don't find that compelling. And the less frequently we do things, the more serious we are about curating every aspect of what we do. And so, like, whenever possible, we have like total control over who we play with, and put a lot of thought into it. Because I want to play with people who are doing stuff that excites me, and I speak for all of us. I want to play with people that are doing different things. Um, I want to play. I don't want to play on a stage only occupied by like white men. Um, and all those things are like equally important to us. And I, also want to play with my friends. I mean, like Soul Glow and Gouge Away are two of my favorite bands in the last decade, but also my friends. And I'm like constantly inspired by what they're doing. Just as those two as examples. Um, Lifetime playing with Anxious, man, that's a trip, right? That's like it was like perfect.
Mhm.
They're like the new kids doing like melodic hardcore and doing it well. And it was just, I thought that was perfect. And Fiddlehead in between, Fiddlehead and Gouge Away in between.
It's really cool to see like just how this music continues to stay alive, but how each generation has like their own interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, really. I mean, you brought them up, but I gotta say it again. Like, how great are Gouge Away and Soul Glow? They're peerless. Like, I hear all their influences, but nobody sounds like either of them.
And on that like curation note you were talking about, it is really cool to see like it feels like more and more of the sort of I guess veteran bands are doing this. Like I know you opened one of the Gorilla Biscuits shows this year and like every show they played had like an amazingly curated lineup. It was like if it was an older band, it felt like there was some unique angle there and there were so many newer bands and so many different like types of subgenres
Yeah,
and different like people, like types of people in the bands and like it just yeah it's cool to see like the sort of older guard of hardcore like making a point to like showcase how diverse the genre is now, how exciting it still is now.
yeah. And I like to think it's not just the gesture of like, look, we're paying attention. I like to think it's because they really are. Like with Gorilla Biscuits, I believe it's because they're really inspired by what young people are doing. And then, they're just like a half a generation above me,
Mhm.
but like that they're paying attention to what we're doing too is like gratifying. They're older than us, and they watched all the bands. They watched all the bands when we played with them. Like you look over when Gel's playing, like they're all sitting there on the floor on the side of the stage. When we're playing, same thing. Like props, like they're paying attention and they're engaged, and they're still one of the best bands.
For sure. Yeah, it was like that when I saw them too. And actually the show I saw them with, Cold World was on.
Mm-hmm.
And Dan obviously is on your new record.
Yeah.
Which is something I wanted to ask about because I think it's kind of funny how like the words "cold world" get shouted out in the lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that was written and then you were like, let's bring Dan in, or was that like tell me how that kind of.
That was written, and I would say it's interesting. Like the verse, I'm always trying to name drop stuff and reference pieces of lyrics from other bands and songs from other bands in our lyrics. Um, and they show up more covertly in like musical passages too. There might be like a bass fill here that's a reference to like a song, a beloved song from 20, 30 years ago, or like a guitar, like a two beat guitar figure or something like that. That's a direct reference to something from mid 80s Discord, Um, that verse was inspired by Pat Flynn uh, from Have Heart and Fiddlehead. Uh, he he's always been so adept at sort of making angry music with sensitivity, and during the last few years, watching what happened, or what has sort of not well, not what happened, but sort of what's been exposed politically in our country. Um, there was so much. So this is a long-winded way of answering the question, but I promise I'm getting there. There was so much in my writing. There was so much hostility and so much venom um, at the sort of like the new lows that the American right wing and were stooping to. Um, and what it sort of exposed in the underbelly of like American culture in general, which has always been there, rotting and hating, but you know, has been like sort of highlighted and empowered by like Trump and his cult. Um, there was so much. I was like drowning in negativity, and I watched Pat online, sort of engaging people that were coming with these like kind of distorted right wing sentiments, like in our scene, you know, and he would engage people with like sensitivity and curiosity, where I would have been like, and patience, where I would have been like, you know, fuck you, get out. um, and he's a teacher, and it really showed in how he engaged people, and also in his lyrics. And I think, and then I sort of at the same time, I was thinking about that and reflecting on how negative these lyrics were. We also, I also, my other band, Bitter Branches, played with this sort of reunion shows with verbal assault. And I was thinking about how lyrically striking that band was, and sort of how different they were than what was happening in most of hardcore in the late '80s. Um, and so the second verse of that song, I was just like revisiting um, my heart, and also like I think what gets overlooked in this sort of focus on expressing anger and outrage, and you know, I believe anger is like usually like a secondary response to like an unmet need, and you know, feeling of being hurt and vulnerable, as protective. And so, but in the process of sort of adding that sentiment to, or that sort of part of my experience to the words, I was like, oh, like this works out perfectly to shout out my friends in Cold World, who I love. I mean, they couldn't be a more different band than us, but they're
Mm-hmm.
awesome, and you know, and they're, and you know, I'm friends with them, and we recorded it, and I was sending the lyrics to Alex, the guitar player, um, just to like, just to, you know, say, hey, what's up, props to you and the band, and when we tracked the vocals, and he was like, how cool would it be if we could sample Cold World, um, you know, because Dan says the name of the band a couple times in their records, and we're like, yeah, and we reached out to Nick Woj and tried to like figure out how to sample that, but they didn't have the raw tracks of those records anymore. Um, they're lost to time and some hard drive somewhere, and so we figured out how to get Dan. Dan lives in England, but we figured out how to get him uh, just to do it live for us and email it to us, and it worked out great. That was a really, really long, convoluted answer, but like I felt like if I just gave you the one sentence answer, it wouldn't be particularly honest or have any background.
For sure. No, I love the long version.
All right.
Um,
But when I heard it, because we had like rough mixes of the record for a while before we got Dan's contribution. And when I heard it, and we put originally got an email to us, and I think we were actually at Fest in Gainesville last year, um, and we got it, and Jared just dropped it in, like put the rough mixes into. He had like a Logic setup on his laptop, and he put the rough mixes in, and then dropped Dan's vocal in, just to experiment where we would put it with where we would put it. And I was just like, I got chills, and then I got this big grin on my face, like, oh shit, it's so amazing. And now when I hear it, I'm just so stoked. I want to do backflips. So thanks to Cold World and thanks to Dan Mills.
Yeah, and like, just kind of thinking about the sort of like the sort of political side and just like the way the country has been recently. I mean, it obviously comes through in this record. Like the literal first thing you hear is like, "This is the America of Fable," which I feel like is such a, right, like you couldn't be more to the point than to have that just literally you click play.
Yeah.
And so something I'm kind of wondering, and I hope I can word this in a way that makes sense, but like, I think obviously Painted Black has written political music in the past, and like I think political music, especially political hardcore, can be so empowering, and I think can actually encourage people to do real stuff, and or can at least give people something to find solace in. But then I sort of like will think about, you'll listen to a song from 20 years ago and they're singing about an issue that we're still dealing with, and it's like almost depressing, where it's like we were saying this and you heard it and it meant something and we're still dealing with it. So I'm curious, like, do you ever like want to go write a song and then feel some level of like, but we've said this and nothing happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a lot of the darkness and negativity that was fueling like these lyrics before I sort of finished them. Like everything was accusatory, and I think even when there's an element of there was an element of structural critique, which is essential for me. It was still pretty hostile and bleak, and I was often struck in the last several years that stuff I had written under like George W. Bush's presidency was not only like appropriate now, but maybe even more appropriate, like during Trump's presidency. And it is discouraging, but you know, human history is like a long history of bloody conflict and exploitation. And our job is to like try to find something in the human experience that redeems us, and to sort of focus on nurturing that and trying to grow something and build something better. And it's but this is going to sound pretentious, but the title, the idea of it being futile, or like here we are, like talking about the same thing or fighting the same fight 20, 30 years later. Um, the title of that song we were talking about a second ago, where Dan Mills does a vocal, it's a reference to to the um, the Camus essay, um, "The Myth of Sisyphus," which is a reflection on the myth of Sisyphus being punished by the gods by having to spend all eternity rolling a boulder uphill, and then at the end of the day, it gets rolled back down and he has to start it over again. And the essay ends. It's a long essay. It ends with the line, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," and the unreasonable silence is a reference to a line in that essay. Um, and I think that like just reflecting on that sort of just is how I think about this question and how I ask it and answer it over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, and like I think it makes, especially just like listening to this new record, reading the lyrics on it, like it makes sense that it's a question that you've already asked yourself.
Not only that, but it's a question I'm constantly asking myself. And then raising kids in that world sort of highlights it and amplifies it in a different way. Makes it more urgent, even too.
Another thing that I wanted to ask about was you had mentioned before kind of like even in the music giving like these little references to, say a hardcore song from 30 years ago or something. And I know that you had talked about you did a track by track breakdown of the Open City record, the whole band did for Brooklyn Vegan. And I know that was something that came up a few times. And also something that Andy said in that track by track that kind of struck me was
Hmm.
he was like, this is the first band that Dan plays guitar in since that Lifetime reunion record, which at this point was 16 years ago.
Hmm.
Which for me, I was like, oh wow. It's like you don't think about it, and it's like it's been so long.
No, that to me is still, and this is what happens when you get older. Like your context of what you consider recent is
Mhm.
constantly being revised. It used to be everything after I finished grad school was recent, but that's 25 years. But the self-titled Lifetime record that some people call the reunion record or whatever, that I still think of as recent,
Mhm.
but it's not. That's
Right.
the reality. Andy really embarrassed me with that whole answer to that question. But he said some really nice things about my guitar playing, which is funny because I'm not good at guitar at all. But I like making things on guitar. So
Well, I'm with Andy. I think that your guitar playing is awesome.
I
Um,
appreciate that.
and something I was also wondering was like, since it has been that long, what's different now about the way that you sort of approach writing and playing guitar compared to what you were doing in like the Lifetime and Kid Dynamite days? Or what's the same?
Mm, good question. Um, I try to. It's this paradox where I try to be informed by and pay homage to the sort of the musical history of hardcore punk, um, without being constricted by the tropes or like musical expectations of hardcore punk. So like I'm never there's gonna oh there's too many double negatives. I am never not conjuring Minor Threat, Bad Brains, Metal Circus era Husker Du, Mission, but also like Mission of Burma and Susie and the Banshees and Sonic Youth. Um, but I'm always informed by specifically Minor Threat and Bad Brains, and but I don't want to be um, sort of bound by the structural expectations of the music, like fast part, mosh part, or like the way you make like a loud, aggressive, abrasive sound is with like a specific kind of like with power chords or bar chords or whatever. Like, um, so it's a weird balance and a paradox, always being like beholden to those traditions, but not uh, bound by them. So I think that's an honest answer.
Yeah.
Um, Specifically in Open City, I tried not to really use power chords at all, with just like very few exceptions. I tried um, to not play to play as unlike Lifetime and Kid Dynamite as possible. I love those bands, but I've done those bands, right? So Open City was really fun to play guitar again and to really just draw from everything else that I love about guitar and weird aggressive music. Uh,
Yeah.
and it brought a lot more of that into Painted Black as well too. Like at this point, I just want to make music that is like undeniably hardcore punk, but also open to like all of our influences.
And I do think that's like, part of what makes Open City feel so kind of, I mean, similar to the new Painted Black album, like, it feels very like urgent and like happening now. And, it's not like, oh, here's four people from multiple other bands doing what they've done before. It's like, it's even, I even think a lot about how like when you look at all the bands the members of Open City have been in, it's like it's awesome. It's what some people might call a supergroup, but like you don't act at all like a supergroup, and that strikes me, I think.
Yeah. We didn't want it to sound, I mean, it had to sound like us, but not like anything we'd done before. And I love the fact that we can be like really obviously pulling from like mid 80s Discord or Revolution Summer or whatever you want to call it, but not have it sound like any of those bands. Um, and really, really pulling from like 90s DIY, specifically like Sarah Kirsch's discography. I know we've talked about ad nauseum in interviews, but like it's very directly pulling from John Henry West and Torches to Rome and Bader Brains, but it doesn't sound like any of those bands. Um, so I don't know. It's that's the fun of Open City, and I think we've been allowing ourselves a lot more of that same freedom in Painted Black, but with very different results.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that type of freedom within hardcore, like within still sort of being part of a lineage, but then having this freedom, I feel like it's something that has been in your music a long time. And um, like the early days of Lifetime, I feel like, especially like that coming out of like that late 80s period where there were like just all these sort of straight edge bands that all sounded like Youth of Today or something. And then
Mm-hmm.
like I feel like in that early 90s period when Lifetime came up, there was all of a sudden like so much innovation within hardcore in so many different directions.
Yeah.
When you were in like those early days of Lifetime, like were you feeling that in real time? Was it sort of feeling like we can take all this stuff that's happened in hardcore and like really do it our own way in a way that maybe like 2 years ago we could have been crucified for?
Yes and no. Like very much yes, but also the reality is at the time the scene was still dominated by like macho and more metal influenced, like increasingly metal influenced, like bro core. Um, and we could do whatever we wanted, and we had musical peers that were coming from that same place, but like a lot of people also were not down for it. Like it wasn't always a warm welcome. I mean, it was a long time, like it was another 5 years before we really found our lane in such that like the people that went to punk and hardcore shows like understood what we were doing and like could sort of fit it into their idea of what was punk and hardcore. And when I say understood what we were doing, I don't mean like, oh, it was so high concept people that it was over people's heads. I just mean like that it wasn't like there's just another, people wanted to call it like emo or whatever, like that it was just another way of expressing like hardcore punk. That like if you can take, here it is, the early 90s, like if you can take this one Slayer riff and turn it into an entire discography and call that hardcore, we can make something that like maybe is like, what would happen if you mated Jawbreaker with Gorilla Biscuits, and we can call that hardcore. And like we're all right. We're both right. And that I think it took Lifetime like 4 or 5 years to get to that point where people were like, oh yeah, this is just like our neighbors in a hardcore band. They just sound different than like what we thought hardcore was. Um, but we definitely had peers like, it was like all these kids that had been like, what is great? That Trial LP by Verbal Assault. Like yeah, Dag Nasty, can I say, kind of started the exploration, but then Trial came out, and that was like, what? What? The later turning point, our neighbors, the later turning point stuff too. Like, um, and so there were these, we played with a lot of bands that, sounded Lifetime in the early days, played with a lot of bands that sounded like, they were drawn from Youth Crew, but we also played with bands like Flagman and Ashes that were coming from pulling the same influences that we were. Resurrection came out of the same group of friends. Ari and I played on that first record, and that was like more influenced by like My War era Black Flag than it was anything else. And like, so there were people taking more risks with what you could do in the boundaries of hardcore, but it was still really like heavily dominated by like chugga chugga, like kickboxing uh, stuff. And I don't know. We worked with some of those. We worked with some of those folks, and not so well with others.
Mm-hmm. Something that I also wanted to ask about was, you like Lifetime specific, especially, and also I think Kid Dynamite, like ended up kind of directly influencing a lot of the stuff that blew up in that kind of early 2000s like emo pop era, like Saves the Day and Fall Out Boy and Newfound Glory and that kind of stuff. When that was
Mm-hmm.
all happening, that was when you started Painted Black, which was like the opposite direction. It was like way more aggressive. Were you sort of conscious of, I guess, the music that your other bands had sort of influenced getting so big and wanting to go in another direction, or was it almost just like not even on your radar at that point, or some other third thing?
I was totally on my. I mean, it's all anybody wanted to talk to me about. Like, aren't you mad that like Lifetime breaks up and Kid Dynamite breaks up, and now there's all these bands that are getting huge with your style? And I was like, the honest answer was people were so disappointed because like people want to get you to talk trash, right? Can I curse on this? On this,
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
people want to get you to talk shit, and I'm not usually interested in that. But also, I wasn't mad at all. I was like, I was flattered by what Saves the Day were doing. How you gonna not be flattered by that? Like, uh, there's no room for like for bitterness in this world. Um, First of all, I was celebrating other people being having success with music. Um, but like when Lifetime started, it was like nobody. People were like, "What are you doing?" Like, and then here it is, like not even 10 years later, and there's kids like moving forward with that style of music, and like you know maybe we cleared the lane, but now they're free to race in it. Like, that's cool to me. Um, but I never felt really compelled to go in that direction. Like, oh, cool, now you could be like really popular and successful with that style of music. So, uh, cool. Well, I'll just do that. Like, that was not appealing.
So, what was sort of the big inspiration for the kind of the way Painted Black sounded and the kind of stuff Painted Black sang about?
Well, I kind of failed at how I originally wanted it to sound. I really wanted to be much more raw, and I mean, I was thinking like Los Crudos or something like that. Or if you're gonna go old, maybe Poison Idea. But it turns out I'm really bad at keeping melody out of music. Like, I tried really hard, but I'm really bad at it. Um, or maybe I'm not strict enough when I set rules for myself. But whatever. Um, but it was like informed by that spirit of like 90s, early 2000s, like DIY, super fast. like making a record cover out of a manila envelope and a hand and a, like I guess silk screen. Like it was like very influenced by that vibe in hardcore punk. And um, at first it wasn't as raw as I wanted it to be. Um, but it got more raw over time, actually.
And that's a unique thing, I think. And I think that, like, you don't see it a lot. You usually see the opposite. And I do think that is one of the things that I hear when I'm like, oh, like, the new Painted Black record it's just a great hardcore record. I mean, you did it analog to tape with Jack Shirley, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it's like, it's so common to hear bands 2 decades into their career just be like, well, now we can record at a big studio and our record sounds polished. And even if the songwriting is good, it's like you do kind of lose that charm. And it's like Painted Black was the opposite direction. And I would imagine that's part of what's making it sound so fresh.
yeah. And it not only does it lose the charm when it's polished, it loses that rough against the grain feel. Like, there've been a few records in the last few years made by older folks that people had a lot of excitement about, and then like I heard them, and like when I hear a record and it sounds toothless to me, I'm not only disappointed, I'm like whatever the inverse of inspired is. um, and I don't want to make stuff that is like toothless. I want to make stuff that is baring your teeth and baring its teeth and makes you cautious about where you're putting your hands. Like that kind of. Um, I mean, as people, we're like the most approachable people you meet, and but I don't want the music to be. I don't want the music to go down smoothly.
Yeah. So, talking about some of your earliest influences, is it kind of a sentimental thing for you to have a Painted Black record come out on Revelation?
Yeah, of course. You can't. The narrative is deep. Um, I mean, so many formative memories associated with like Revelation bands and records. Um, like you don't want to hear old people talk about life before the internet, but like taking the train to go to a record store where I knew they had just gotten the uh, side by side 7 inch in. Like those experiences of like traveling to find a record and calling a record store to be like, did you get a shipment in from Revelation? And like getting on a train to go find it is like, those are like really important building blocks of what like I am as a musician, I guess, or music maker, and like as just as a person who in love with music and art and like creation. Like Revelation was after Discord probably the most essential label that like I was paying attention to in the '80s. Um, and it's really cool to work together. Like I remember before like you could the advertising turnaround time for fanzines was months, right? And like Revelation would have these ads where it would be like, you know, Gorilla Biscuits start today, out now. And, you found out later, just like hearing stories that like, not only was it out now, they were like still arguing over the design, and it was held up in the stage of like finishing the layout, and like how long it takes when you send something finished to the pressing plant to turn around and then to get it distributed. Like, but we would see these ads, that would say out now for like the Gorilla Biscuits LP or the Judge LP, and we'd like drive down to Vintage Vinyl in Woodbridge, or take a train to like Venus in New York, and be like, oh, is it going to be there? And of course, it wasn't there. And you'd keep trying and hoping, and eventually, sometimes like a year later, you would you'd find it. And like I said, you'd find out later that those ads were sent out like when the record was not yet at the pressing plant. But one of the biggest human failures is our constant like optimism in making plans. Like we make plans as if everything's going to go right. And I think that's what happened with a lot of independent releases in the 80s. But yeah, that's a long way of saying, yeah, I'm stoked to be working with Revelation. Um, there are these times, and I have these like crazy like fanboy experiences where like we'll like have a conversation about like some element of the record, and then I'll like hang up and I'll be like, I just got off the phone with the drummer from Side by Side. Holy shit,
Mm-hmm.
that's so wild. Um,
Yeah,
who's of course just another person that has been making music for a long time, like me, but I don't know, it's kind of a thrill.
totally. I mean, there's that, like you, like right now, I'm talking to someone who's made many records I love. That's awesome. And you're also just a person. That's also awesome. So
It's
I
one of the
don't know if
coolest
that's weird
things.
for me to say, but
No, I appreciate
yeah.
it. It's kind of you, and but also it's like real, like how many times have I met my musical heroes, or had this period in my life when like, oh, like all my favorite songwriters are friends of mine that I talk on the phone to. It's wild.
On the other side of the sort of label thing, Open Cities on Get Better, which is, like a much newer, also very awesome label. Tell me what drew you to
Hmm.
that one.
We've known Alex for a while. Alex relocated to Philadelphia, probably like 10 years ago, maybe. And I really like their mission. Um, and he has like a queer centric, queer positive project. And it's sort of like in talking to we self released our first LP, and I don't think any of us had the energy or the spare finances to do that again. And the only label that all four of us agreed on talking to was Get Better.
Another thing that stood out to me about the two new records is the artwork of both the Painted Black and Open City records feel very cut from the same cloth. Is that like an intentional, conscious thing or a coincidence?
Mm. I mean, both bands have me. There's a 50% overlap in the bands.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's part of the answer. It's interesting because I think Rachel went to school for design and has not really taken an active hand in the design of the record. Um, and I've never spoken with her at length about that. Um, the black and white aesthetic is like maybe played out in punk, but also has an enduring charm.
Yeah.
And for this record, we got Jem Cohen to do the art, which is, if you don't know, is the person responsible for the design of most of the Fugazi records, and also for the filming and editing and production of the Fugazi movie Instrument, which is probably my favorite music movie of all time. And if you haven't seen it, you should find it and see it like immediately. Um, yeah, and so we had somehow gotten in touch with Jem to ask about the first record, and they don't work with a lot of bands. We sent them the music. They were like, "Oh, this is cool. I'm into it." But then stuff is going on in Jem's life where he wouldn't be able to work on it for like another 8 months, and we were already at the sort of the like chomping at the bit to get it out. So we kind of tabled that and came back to him like recently, and we're like, "Hey, remember us?" Um, we're still really interested in working together, and they had the time and the wherewithal, and we again sent them the music, and we were just like, and kind of passed it off to him. Like we didn't. Um, um, he had a bunch of black and white photos that he was looking at to use of his own photos, and um, we sort of like I guess circled the ones that we liked the best, and he incorporated some of those. Um, and we just left it with him, and then you know we got it back. We were like, wow, Jim Cohen. All right.
It definitely, in both cases, I think goes really well with the music.
Thank you. I appreciate that. With the Painted Black record, we for the first time, like we've had a similar sort of design idea for everything since like 2009, probably. And usually the photos are like friends of ours who are photographers or like something we found online that isn't copyrighted but looks really cool and we can get a high res version of. And this time I felt we were like sort of scratching our heads, and I fell in love with this photo I found online. I was like, yeah, but we can't steal this photo. It's like part of a photographer who was like working, and it's like part of the body of work of a photographer that was working in New York in the 80s, and it's like part of a like a sort of a book that's a collection of his photos from a certain time and place. And yeah, I was like, I'm not gonna try to steal something like that, like use it without permission, like that's low. Um, and so we contacted with them and just were like, what? We were like, what? Can we license this photo to use? And it turns out we could. You pay him a really reasonable fee and use the photo, which we adored, for the cover of the record. So awesome.
Ask and ye shall receive.
Yeah.
So Lifetime came up in the New Brunswick scene, which is sort of like a very storied music scene, and you've been in the Philly scene for a long time, which at this point also has like at least national, probably international reputation. How do those two music scenes sort of compare and contrast for you?
Um, they're both the result of like a bunch of enthusiastic kids trying to make a thing happen. Um, New Brunswick's a college town, so people are typically cycle in and out of there in like 4 years. Um, but the one thing about a bigger college city is that like there's a lot of reasonably affordable, quasi rundown rental opportunities for kids that, you know, smaller schools, people often stay in campus housing the whole time, but like where I went to college and certainly also at Rutgers, like people move out of the dorms after 1 or 2 years, and there's a kind of an abundance of somewhat rundown, affordable houses and apartments for young people to live in where you can like make a lot of noise or like run a DIY printing press or like do whatever. And so like none of us were from New Brunswick, but that's where we sort of started. Um, that's where our base of operations sort of started, and the Bouncing Souls were already there, and there's a lot of creative stuff happening, and then we just kind of grew into something much much larger than the sum of its parts. More and more bands, more kids doing stuff, like shows like in every manner of weird place. Um, Garage, basement, warehouse. backyard. And Philly is Philly. I was just talking about this in an interview. Philly was a city when I moved there that was quite frequently like the place that bands would skip on tour. They'd play DC and New York and move on. And and then like a bunch of there were shows here. Like I had been to shows here, and um, usually they were at like clubs or bars that had been like repurposed as places that you could pull off an all ages show sometimes. Um, but then in the early '90s, it really like just the DIY thing really exploded here, and like these groups of kids would start doing shows um, at the Unitarian Church, at the Calvary Church in West Philly, at the YMCA, at any number of basements throughout the city and warehouse spaces, uh, VFW halls and fire halls in the suburbs. There was like a thriving warehouse venue scene that sort of ran the range from like bizarro anarchist music to like straight up hardcore to like much more feminist focused music. And there's this one block actually right near where I live now that had three different venues on it, a lot that all overlapped in time for a good chunk of time. um, that was Stalag 13, the Fake House, and the Kill Time, and they're all on one block that's now like hella gentrified, but it's like so much amazing stuff. And like group of kids that were in a band called Policy of Three started this thing called the Cabbage Collective, and they're the ones who started doing shows at the like in church basements throughout the city. Robbie Red Cheeks was doing shows, and then like after a while there were all these different collectives and groups of kids putting on shows. And of course, when you've got like a lot of places to play, you get a lot of bands, and you see some of the most exciting shows of your life in like a living room behind the library, and that's what happened.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see, like, even in the past like 10 years, just like how much the Philly scene still grows.
Yeah, blows my mind.
So one last thing I want to ask before we have to go. In 2021, there was a post on the Lifetime Facebook page that said the band is writing new music. Any updates on that?
No.
Got it. All right, Dan. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. It was this is a really fun interview. I appreciate it. They're not all awesome. So I really am grateful for the questions and the conversation.
Thank you. That means a lot, and I had a blast myself. So
awesome.
Usual. All
really nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
Hey, thanks so much to Dan. Thanks for listening. Go check out the new Painted Black record, Famine, out on Revelation Records, and the new Open City record, Hands in the Honey Jar, out on Get Better Records. And stay tuned for that new Bitter Branches album that Dan brought up during the episode. And hey, if you like what you heard, subscribe, give us a good rating, tell your friends about it. Any small thing like that goes a long way, and we really, really appreciate it. Thanks again, and see you next time.